Hey, what's up guys, how's it going? Welcome to the Fastify Basics tutorial. In today's video, you're going to learn everything that you need to know to get started with Fastify. So what is Fastify? Fastify is a web framework for Node.js highly focused on providing the best developer experience with the least overhead and powerful plugin architecture inspired by Happy and Express. Or in simple words, it's just a web framework for Node.js. You can use this to build powerful APIs. It is similar to Express. So what are the features of Fastify? It is highly performant. It can serve up to 30,000 requests per second. It is extensible with its hook, plugins, decorators, middlewares, and things like that. And one of the greatest features of Fastify is the Schema Validation. It handles the schema validation for your routes automatically so that you don't have to do that manually. And also it is very developer friendly. You can create complex APIs very easily. If you want to do that with vanilla Node.js, you have to write tons of code. But Fastify makes things very easy for you. And also it has a better logging system on the console. And if you are a TypeScript lover like me, then it is also TypeScript ready. Now Fastify claims that it is one of the fastest web frameworks in town. On their website, they also have a benchmark which says that Fastify is the fastest web framework that is available. Express is on number 3. I'm not sure if Fastify is the fastest or not, but it is really fast in terms of development. Now, what are the requirements before you learn Fastify? Well, you have to understand basic JavaScript and Node. You should have basic understanding of arrow functions, or at least normal functions, then asynchronous JavaScript with promise, async await, and also you should have basic understanding of array methods like for each, map, filter, then npm, which is Node Package Manager. You should have understanding of how to install and remove packages. Then you have a basic understanding of JSON. If you don't worry, I have made entire videos about array methods like for each, map, filter, Node Package Manager, which is npm, and also JSON. If you want to learn about them, please watch this video. I'll put the link on the description. And also the basic understanding of web is required. For example, how the request response cycle works, then what are the HTTP methods, the status codes, things like that. But if you don't worry, I will explain things briefly in this video. If you already know about them, you can skip this part. I will put the timestamps too. So let's understand how the web actually works. In the web, we have two entities. We have a client and we have a server. The client is most probably your browser. Now the client might need some data from the server, so it sends a request for some data to the server. When the server gets the request, it gathers some data, then send it as a response to the client. And that's how this request response cycle works and how it ends. Now what is an API? An API stands for Application Programming Interface. It is kind of like the medium of the request response cycle. It allows the client and the server to talk to each other and send and receive data back and forth. We're going to build only APIs, and then you can hook those APIs with your front end like React or Angular or Vue to create a powerful full stack app. Now there are a bunch of HTTP methods available. These 4 are the most popular and useful, and most probably you'll use either one of them. So we have the get method. If you want to get some data from the server, you send a get request. If you want to add some change to the data, you send a post request to the server. If you want to update some data, you send a put request. And finally, if you want to delete some kind of data, obviously you will send a delete method. Now today's video, we're only going to focus on the get method and the post method, because if you know about these two methods, get and post, then you'll know how to use other methods too. So these are the basic concepts that I wanted to briefly explain. I hope you have got the basic idea. Now we are ready to write some code. So if you are interested about learning Fastify, please like this video and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss this kind of tutorials. So without further ado, let's get started. Let me give you a quick introduction of mine. My name is Anjan. I'm a full stack web developer who can develop complex web applications from UI to backend systems. You can watch my work by visiting my portfolio website thatanjan.me, then just go to projects. And here you'll see all of the projects that I have worked on. I'm looking for a new opportunity in a company where I can provide great value with my skills and knowledge. So if you are a recruiter or someone who wants a new team member who can solve problems, can develop real-world application, feel free to contact me. You can reach out to me by email, LinkedIn, or Twitter. All of the links are going to be in the description just for you. Alright, enough of my introduction. Let's get straight into the tutorial. So I have already created a directory. I have called it Fastify Guide YT. I have two terminals open. So first of all, I need to initialize the package.json with npm init -y. And now let's install the packages. We need to install Fastify, then Fastify form body, which is just a plugin. So let's install them. Alright, so the packages are now installed. I also need to install another package called nodemon as a dev dependency. So npmi nodemon --save -dev. Alright, so the necessary packages are now installed. Let's open the directory on our text editor. So let's open the package.json file. Now in the package.json file, I'm just gonna create a dev script for running our dev server. I want to run the dev server with nodemon, and the file will be inside source directory, then index.js. So let's create the directory, src, and then index.js. So this index.js is our entry file. So first of all, we're going to create a basic node server with Fastify. It is pretty easy to do. First of all, we need to require Fastify package. So const Fastify require Fastify. And then we need to create an app. So const app. And we just need to call Fastify. Now Fastify has a logging system. To enable that, we need to pass an object here, and we just need to say logger equals to true. This will enable the logging system. And now we need to create a port for our server. So const port. Now this port will come from the environment variable. So process.env .port. If that's not available, that means we are on development, then it will be 8000. Now we need to listen to our application. So app.listen. We just need to pass the port. And app.listen is asynchronous. If any kind of error happens, we need to handle that. So catch. It will be a function, and we need to get the error. If any kind of error happens, we're gonna log it to the console. So app.log.error, and we just need to pass the error. Then we need to exit the process. And now we can run our server. So on another terminal, I'm gonna run the dev server with the script that I have created. So npm run dev. And the message is server listening at this URL. Okay, so our server is working. So now let's see how we can create routes. First of all, we're gonna learn about how to create get routes. Then we will learn how to create post routes. Now what is a get route again? Get route when you want to get some data from the server. Now there are two ways you can create a route. One way is to use the app.route method. And inside the route method, you need to pass an object. And inside the object, you need to specify the HTTP method, status code, the handler function, everything. But I don't like this approach. there is another way that you can do this. You can call the HTTP method on the app. For example, if you want to send a GET request, you can just call the method app.get. If you want to send POST requests, you can just call app.post. Okay, so we need to send a GET request, so we're gonna call app.get. So inside the function, so inside the method, you need to pass some parameter. First parameter will be the endpoint. So I will just call it hello. So this will be our endpoint, and the second argument will be a handler function. So I'm going to create an anonymous function. Now this function takes two parameters. One is the request, another one is the reply. If you have experience with Express, this is similar to that. In Express, we call it rec and res. You can call it whatever you want, but in the documentation, they use request and reply. So I will also use that here. So request and reply, and inside the function body I will just send a response. To send a response, you don't need to use the reply object, you can just return something and that will be used as a response. So I want to return a string which will say hello world, and I'm missing a closing parenthesis, so this will do the work for us. Now to test the API, we need some kind of API testing client. I'm going to use Insomnia. It is fully free and open source. So I'm going to create a new request. I will call it just test. And it will be get request. And I will just copy the URL from here. And the endpoint will be /hello. So let's just send, and you can see it has given us a response, hello world. So you can see that how easy it is to create a API with Fastify. So this was a dummy example. So let's create a CRUD API. I will delete this and I will create a file inside the source. I will call it users.json. And I'll paste some dummy user data here. So this is the user data that we are going to work with. So let's create a get route to get all of the users. So app.get, and the endpoint will be /get users. And I will create a handler function. Again, request and reply. And inside the function body, we need to return the users, but before that we need to import the users. So const users require ./users.json, and we just need to return users. So let's test it out. I'll create another request. I will call it get users. I'll just copy the URL from here, and the endpoint will be get users. So let's send, and you can see we have an array of user data. So our get users API is working fine. Now that we have learned about how to create a get route, now we're going to learn about something called query parameters and path parameter. So let's first understand query parameters. To understand, I'm going to paste a URL. So you might have seen URL like this. We have the domain, then we have an endpoint like get users, then we have a question mark. After the question mark, we have some key value pairs. This is what we call query parameters. Basically, with query parameters, you can pass additional information with the URL. So let's use that in our get users route. Now in our get users route, we are returning all of the users. What if someone wants only the male users or only the female users? We can send users by their gender using the query parameters. To access the query parameters, we need to use the request object. So request has a query object, and inside the query object, we have our query parameters. So I'm going to destructure them. So I expect a query parameter called gender, and it will come from request.query. If gender is undefined, that means gender doesn't exist. We want to send all of the users. Else, if gender exists, then we want to filter the user from the users array. So we need to use the filter method from the users array. So users.filter. And inside the filter, we need to pass a callback function. So I'm going to pass 1. The first parameter will be the actual user. And we need to return a condition if the user.gender, and we have to convert it to lowercase, so to lowercase, and we need to match it with the gender query parameter, and also we are going to make it lowercase. So this filter method will give us an array of users. So const filtered users, and we're gonna return filtered users. So let's test it out. To pass a query parameter, you can use the URL or you can use the query tab on Insomnia. So I'm gonna pass the gender as parameter and the value will be male. So let's send, and you can see we have all the users that are male. If I just pass female, and it gives me all the users that are female. If I just pass some gibberish, it has given us an empty array because this gender doesn't exist on our users array. So this is what we call query parameter. Now let's understand path parameter. So I'm going to paste another URL. So I'm going to delete this one. Now you might be using Twitter or any kind of social media. So if you go to twitter.com and if you want to visit someone's profile page, then you go twitter.com/the username. So in my case, it will be thatonjohn. That's my username. You can follow me on Twitter if you want, but doesn't matter. So if you want to visit my profile, you go to this URL. If you want to visit Elon Musk's profile, you go to twitter.com/Elon Musk profile name. So you can see that after the twitter.com, this part of the URL is not static. It is changing based on the users. So this is what we call a dynamic route, or also you can say a path parameter. Basically, instead of putting a username like this, we can put a placeholder. You can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it username. So you can think of this as a placeholder. So whatever you pass after the twitter.com, username will be equals to this. So this is what we call a path parameter. So let's see that in action. I'm going to create a new get route for getting a single user. So app.get, and the endpoint will be /get_user. And to expect a query parameter, we need to pass / then the colon. And after the colon, you can call it whatever you want, the parameter. I will call it ID because I want to get user by their ID. So inside the users.json, we have an array of users and every user have an ID. So we want to get user by their ID. So if someone pass /getUser/1, then we need to send the user whose ID is 1. So after the URL, we need to pass the handler function. Again, I need to get the request, then reply. Now the path parameter is stored inside the params object in the request. So let's get that. Const ID will be request.params.id. But the ID will be a string. We need to convert it to a number because our user object ID is a number. So we need to call the parseInt method. And I'm going to pass the request params. And the second argument will be the base, which is 10. And now we need to find the user by their ID. So const user, and we need to call the find method in the users array. And we need to pass a callback function again. So user will be the first parameter. And we need to return a condition. So we want to check if user.id matches with our params ID. So now let's send the user. So let's test it out. I'll copy this URL and I'll create a new request. It will be get user by ID. I'll paste the URL here, and the URL will be get user, not get users. And after that, we're gonna pass the path parameter. I'm gonna pass 1 for user ID 1. So let's send. And you can see we have a user of ID 1. Let's pass 5. And we have a user of ID 5. So our path parameter is working fine. But what if we pass an invalid path parameter? For example, a user ID that doesn't exist, like 51. If we hit send, you can see it is taking a very long time and it will never finish. The reason is we need to return JSON as response. If the find method doesn't find any user, then this user variable will be undefined. But we cannot pass undefined as JSON. So we're gonna throw an error. But how we're gonna throw an error? That's pretty easy. So if the user doesn't exist, we need to use the reply object. And to specify a status code, we need to call the status method. And the status code will be 404. Then you can send something. Use the send method. And I'm gonna pass an object. It will have a message property. And the message will be user not found. So now let's test it out. I will hit send. And you can see we have an error 404 not found. Message is user not found. Okay, so that's how you can send an error as response. So now that we have understand how to use get route, let's understand how to create post route. But before that, I want to split my code into different files because you can see in the index.js file, it's getting messier. So I'm gonna split the routes into different routers. So let's create a file inside the source. I will call it routers.js. And inside the routers file, we need to export a function. So const handler. And this function will take 3 parameters. First one will be the Fastify instance. I will call it app. Then options. And finally a done function. And we have to call the done function inside the handler. And let's export that. Module.exports will be handler. And now we need to register the router in our app. So app.register. And we need to require that file. So require. And the path will be /routers. And I will cut all of these routes. And I will paste them in the handler function in the routers file. And now everything should work fine. So let's send a request. Okay, so I made a mistake. I haven't imported the users array. So I will cut this line from here. And I will paste them here in the routers file. And now if I send a request, and you can see we have still the error, users not found. If I just pass 5, we have a user ID of 5. Now you can create different routers in Fastify. To add a different router, you need to pass an object inside the register function. And we need to pass a prefix property. And the prefix will be the router name. I will call it /API. So this will add a prefix of API to every single endpoint that we have created in the routers file. So now if you go to /getUsers, it will be an invalid route. You need to go to /API/getUsers. So let's see that in action. So now if I send, you can see that route not found. If I just go to /API/getUsers/5, now it should work fine. And you can see it is working fine. So this is how you can modularize your code very easily with Fastify. It will be very useful when you will have a large amount of code. You will have a lot of APIs. Okay, so now that we have modularized our code, now let's see how we can create a post route. So in the post route, I want to create a new user in the users array. So let's create that. App.post. And the route will be add user. And again, our handler function. And let's get the request. To create a new user, I need to create a new ID. The ID will be total users length plus 1. So const ID will be users.length plus 1. Now the new user information will be inside the request body. So let's create a new user, const new user, and I'm gonna spread out the request body. And I will also add an ID. And I will push the new user in the users array. And finally, I'm gonna return the new user as response. So let's test it out. I will copy this and I'll create a new request and it will be add user. I will paste the URL and it will be post method, and this time we will use request body. Now there are different ways you can pass request body. You can pass valid JSON or you can pass form URL encoded. So I'm going to use form URL encoded for now. Our new user will have a name, and name will be Anjan. I'm going to pass gender of male. So let's hit send. And you can see that we have an error, unsupported media type, and that was expected because Fastify only handles JSON as request body. It doesn't handle form URL encoded. So that's why we have installed a package called Fastify form body. It is actually the plugin for Fastify. So in the index.js, we need to register that plugin. So app.register, and we need to require the plugin, and it will be Fastify form body. So let's save the file and test it out. Now let's click send. Route post API. Oops, I didn't pass the full URL. The URL will be /API/add user. So now let's send. We're still having the error, unsupported media type. What did we do wrong? Oops, the plugin will come before the routers, so I'll paste it here above the routers. Now it should work fine. Let's send. And you can see we have a user's name Anjan and ID of 11. Let's change name to Jack. Now let's send. And you can see we have an ID of 12, name is Jack. And if we go to get users, and the endpoint will be /API/getUsers, let's hit send. Let's disable the query. Now let's send. And at the bottom, you can see we have 2 new users, but we're not actually modifying the actual users array. This is just inside the memory. If we restart our server, so npm run dev, we should not have those new users. Now if I send again, and if I go to the bottom, you can see we don't have the new users. So those new users that we have created were only inside the memory. So we have successfully created the post route. Now let me teach you one of the great feature of Fastify, which is schema validation. So what is schema? A schema is just a structural representation of some kind of data. You can create a schema for request body, query parameters, and so on. If you create a schema for the request body, you can specify what properties would you expect in the request body and what type of data those properties should store. And you can also create properties that should be required and some should be optional and things like that. So let's see that in action. So in the app.post method and also in the app.get method, as our first parameter, we have passed the API endpoint. And for the second parameter, we have passed a handler function. But you can pass options as second parameter and the handler function as third parameter. So I'm going to pass options. I will call it add user options. So let's create that add user options at the top. Const add user options will be an object. And inside the object, we can pass a schema object. And inside the schema, we're going to specify body because we want to create a schema for body. Then type will be object. And you need to pass a properties object. And inside the properties, you have to specify all of the property that you expect for the request body and also their possible value types. So I want a name and its type will be a string. Then I want, I need to add a comma. Then I want age and type will be number. And age can also be a string. You can represent 10 also as a string, right? So what if you want to pass two type? Well, you can do that. You just need to pass an array. So it will be an array. First it will be number and it will be string. So if someone pass age equals to 10, it will be valid. And if someone pass age to 10 and 10 is a string, it will also be valid. Then I want gender and type will be string. And we can also pass something called enum. Enum is an array of possible values. So a gender can be either male and female and others. So if the given value for gender is none of these, then it will throw you an error. So the value of the gender has to be either one of these. So that's what an enum is. And these are the properties we want. And after the properties, you can specify some properties as required. So I'm going to pass a required field. And it will be an array of field name. So I want name to be required and gender. So this is our schema for the request body. Fastify will automatically do the schema validation for us. If the request body doesn't match with the schema, it will throw you an error. Okay, so it is super useful. So let's test it out. So let's go to Insomnia and let's go to the add user. And for request body, this time I'm going to use JSON instead of form URL encoded. So I want name. Name will be a string. It will be Anjan. And gender will be male. So let's hit send. And you can see we have a new user. So let's pass something for the gender outside of our enum values. So I'm just gonna pass some gibberish. So let's click send. And you can see bad request body.gender should be equal to one of the allowed values. And if I pass a number instead of string for name, wait a minute, what just happened? I put name equals to 19, but 19 is a number, and on the schema we have specified name as string. So what just happened? Well, behind the scene, Fastify uses a package called AGV for schema validation. That package has converted number 19 to string 19. That is called type coercion, which is the default behavior enabled by Fastify, but we can disable it. So let's just go to index.js, and we need to require that AGV package, and that is pre-installed. So const AGV require AGV. Actually, let me show you the documentation. Just go to the Fastify, and on the bottom reference section, go to the validation and serialization, then go to validation. Here you will find the information about type coercion. We just need to copy this piece of code, and I will paste it here. Actually, this one will be capital A. It is actually the AGV constructor, and we're creating a new instance of it. We're going to remove these two properties. I'm going to comment out the remove additional property. I will explain it after a few minutes. And coerce type is array. I'm going to make it false. Alright, so now let's save the file. And let's go to Insomnia. Now let's click send. We should have error. Couldn't connect to server. We have problem. Fastify.setValidator compiler is not a function. Okay, I understand. It will not be Fastify, it will be app, and this line will come after the app. Now it should work fine. We don't have any error. So let's go to Insomnia. Let's send. We still have the same thing. Okay, so it should not be string false, it will be the boolean false. Now it should work fine. Alright, so we have bad request body.name should be string. And what if I don't pass name at all? And it says body should have required property of name. So our schema validation is working fine. I will change it back to my name. And it is working fine. What if we pass some extra values? So I'm gonna pass country, and it will be BD. So let's click send, and you can see we have country BD, but we didn't specify any country field in our schema. So by default, Fastify will allow any kind of additional properties that we will pass. But what if you want to ignore additional properties, the properties that are not defined in the schema? Well, you can do that pretty easily. Let's go to index.js, and on the AGV constructor object, I have commented out the remove additional property. I will uncomment it out. So if you pass remove additional to true, it will try to remove all of the additional properties, but we have to do another thing. We have to add another property inside the schema. We have to pass a property called additional properties, and we have to pass false here. So you have to do two things. You have to pass a property remove additional to true, and additional properties in the schema to false. So let's see if it works or not. So let's click send, and you can see we don't have the extra property country. It didn't throw you an error, but it just ignored it. So remove additional property true will only ignore properties where schema additional properties is false, but you can pass all instead of true. Then you don't have to pass the additional properties to false. it will always ignore additional properties in all kind of schema. So now let's send, and you can see it is still working fine. If you want to learn more about schema validation, just read the documentation. You can do a lot of with it. I'm not gonna go over every single option. Now, just like you can pass a schema for body, you can use schemas for query string, like I've shown you, then params, then headers and things like that. You can also pass schema validation for response. Now, before I end this video, let me show you one last thing. You can see in the routers file, we have specified all of the options, then we have specified all of the handler function. So it is kind of getting messier, but we can do much better than this to make our code clean. So I'm going to create two more files in the source directory. One will be options.js, another one will be handlers.js. So let's go to options.js. So I will I will cut the add user options and I will paste it here, and let's just export it, module.exports, and I'm gonna pass add user options, and let's open up the handlers file. I'll close the index.js file. Let's go to routers. First, I will cut the getUsers handler function, and I'll paste it here, and this function name will be getUsers. Then I will cut this handler, getUser by ID, and the function name will be getUser by ID. And then finally the add user handler. And the function name will be add user. So let's export them. Add user, then get user, then get user by ID, and we have to import the users. So I will cut this line and I will paste it on the handlers file, and in the options we can specify the handler for the route. So inside the schema object, I'm gonna pass handler. A handler will be add user. So let's import that, const add user from require / handlers, and let's go to routers. Let's import the add user options. So const add user options from require / options. And now let's import other handlers for other routes. So I will just copy this line, and instead of add user, we're gonna import get users and get user by ID, and we're gonna pass them here, and get user by ID. Okay, so let's test it out. I will click send again. Couldn't connect to server. Let's see what happens. Maybe we have an error. Missing handler function for post. What did I do wrong? Okay, so the handler should not be inside the schema. It should be inside the options object. Now it should work fine. Let's send. And you can see our add user route is working. Let's go to get users and let's click send. It's working. Let's go to get user by ID. Yeah, it is working fine. So every route is working totally fine. So you can see that we have modularized our code and our project is looking very clean. and it was very easy because of Fastify. So that's all I wanted to show you. If you want me to create more projects with Fastify instead of Express, please do let me know in the comment section. I would love to hear from you. So that's all I wanted to show you. So if the video has been helpful for you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. If you have any question, please do let me know in the comment section. If you want to get daily tips and tricks, you can follow me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Instagram as thatonjohn, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.